suspect most people weren't really worried about the Matthew Plan, other than the Matthew Plan fed into the BDP, Belfast Urban Area Plan, and that put down kind of parameters about how you develop in the city, and put down broad kind of master plan type agenda, and would propose the road infrastructures and slum dwelling replacement to propose urban clearance, that they were calling was for quality housing. People took it for granted, I suppose, in the period in the 70s and 80s, that an association, an executive was formed, that you would just go in, wipe and restore, replace houses, and you're getting better houses. What's your problem? And I suspect most architects probably didn't think anything other than it was a job coming through, you did your job. And I suppose in the city there was that kind of split between what may have been people who were doing Catholic schools and Catholic churches, and others who were doing commercial projects or state schools. If you were a church organisation, whatever your denomination was, you probably went to the people you knew to divide your work for you. One of my former bosses went to Mass every day and made sure he went to communion every day. Now, he was quite a religious kind of character anyway, but what it did was make sure he was seen by the priest every day, which meant you would get another job. Is that any different to people who went on the golf course? Probably not, actually, but but you had to realise actually, is that what he's doing, or is he just a very religious kind of focused person? You know? But the executive started up and they formed this list. You applied for the list, put your name forward, and then you got a job on a rota. And at that stage initially, there were probably only 20 practices on a rota, or thereabouts. So you got to work fairly frequently. And I suspect in a way that most people then do what a lot of people do now. You were told to do it, so you did it. That notion about someone with authority, or somebody who actually did the plan, saying this is the plan, because I've done plans elsewhere, and this is the right thing to do for your city, and if you want to be the right person for your city, you'll do this. And a lot of people fell into that pattern, which is why others are saying it didn't really impact on them. Because if you didn't do housing work, it wouldn't have impacted on you at all. You worked in commercial things and schools. If you did housing work, it impacted on you because you got jobs. So I think that the Matthew Plan is, and most people, about saying there's a stop line, you will not build above the top of the Glen Road or the Springfield Road, and that notion was still held true, still hold true at some level, but was still held true even in the early part of the 80s, when people were looking for land in West Belfast to build houses. In a way, you look at it, it seems reasonable, it seems right, because keep inside that line and build the city, and yet what you got now, is it what you want actually? Is it what other forces actually change that kind of plan? So has the Matthew Plan any kind of positive aspects about stopping suburban growth, or did it just cause people to manipulate suburban growth when they wanted?
I was very lucky to spend the time working in London and in Germany. But then also during that time, seeing quite a bit of other cities in Europe. You know, I suppose when I came back here, I suppose there was a wee bit of the kind of thinking, well, why can't we have some of that? You know, in terms of roads infrastructure policy and housing policy, the two of those combined. There is still, in terms of housing, let's just do it the same way we did it 70 years ago. This was just wide scale blanket redevelopment, as opposed to doing it bit by bit, incrementally. That also helps to keep people living in an area, keeps that community intact. You just a blanket demolition and then very slow rebuild, and in that process you've just wiped out an entire area. And I suppose very much was a lot of the reasons for setting up the forum together with Ciaran, Mark Hackett, Ken Stout and a few others. Very much the idea of why can't we have real streets, real places, real squares, and a vibrant city, not a city with very few people living in the city. You know, when we set up the forum back in 2009, very much to try to campaign for a more connected and very much people who live in the city, connected with the city, and not just a city for the commuters and the visitors. Yeah. The part of the Cathedral Court Arts Festival, we've invited Ron Vayner over to Belfast. They haven't been here for about 20 years, and we invited them over just to give a talk. And Jackie Redpath, a few people from the Shankill came down. The next day we went for a walk up the Shankill, just the two of them talking about old times, things that were and went on, whatever, and we went into the Rex bar. And then Jackie Red Pass said, here, come on in for a pint, whatever. So we went into the Rex bar and sitting around being on Jackie Red Pass, Ken Starrett, and Mark, being ourselves and talking urbanism in the Rex bar. And I was wrong, Jack turned around and said, well, you guys should set up a forum. And then Ken said, I have a forum for Alternative Belfast. I said, yeah, that's it. And we stuck with the name. We thought it was a daft idea, but we stuck with it. But it does root the work in the city, in the neighbourhoods, and that's where our work is. A lot of the decisions that were made in the late 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, and later, and we are still attempting to restitch the gaps that have been left by those decisions. We're actually trying to get the city restitched together again. But the biggest change in Belfast over the years has been the depopulation. We've done some studies, comparative studies of the depopulation of Belfast compared to Nottingham, Cardiff, Newcastle, similar-sized cities to Belfast, pretty fine. And Belfast, basically over the past 40, 50 years, from the end of the 40s or the 50s, Belfast population has gone down from just under 500,000 people to currently about 273,000. And at the same time, all the various medium-sized towns surrounding Belfast, from sort of Carrick, Bangor, Lisburn, Antrim, they've all increased by the same amount. And that's kind of, it links together with the post-Second World War, late 40s, early 50s, industrial decline. And this continued obviously during the Second World War, but it continued then at the end of the 40s and the early 50s. And the authorities, government at the time, were kind of saying, right, how do we arrest this? How do we bring in the new industries? What shaped Belfast was then to plan these industrial areas outside, up in Antrim, in Craigavon, right? To then to service these new areas of production by a new road network. And then on top of that, to move the population to these new industrial areas. There's also a wonderful film, Tomorrow's Road from 1972, a documentary of the BBC, which just records the whole of the demolition of housing. But at that time, quite interesting when they did the documentary, the BBC were questioning why were they knocking down these buildings to make way for a road where there was such a housing crisis in the city. And then what then compounded the problem, when these new industries were then overtaken by Far Eastern industries, whether it's in the textile sector, in the electronics, whatever, and then suddenly those industries closed down, and then people were all left in these newly built up areas, right? And where was the employment? Employment was then back in Belfast, so they were then having to commute, and that's why we have such a sort of a commute into the city centre. And again, in that film Tomorrow's Road, one of the engineers from Travers Morgan, who were the consultants who were building the new road, and he's walking through this whole area around York Street where all these houses have been demolished. And he's talking about how the contractors were being held up, and they were way behind in terms of the programme to build the road. If that delay had not occurred, we might have actually had the full Belfast urban motorway with an actual motorway running right around the entire city.
This was a policy from road service that said you will do what are called shared surface streets, and it was coming from a Dutch thing called the Woonerf. And the Woonerf was a settlement pattern in the Netherlands that said you should have clusters of houses, probably no more than 25 or thereabouts. You remove the footpaths, you use landscaping gardens as a way to move, project into the street, and the cars will slow down, and you can park 1 or 2 cars, and that place with good landscaping is the future for residential areas. And that was the conversation. So to the extent that people were taking by the housing executive and by the private practice purse can often look at projects in the Netherlands at Vunger that were the basis I was given to say this is your project you will use as your kind of template effectively for your housing projects in Ardagh. And what I tried to do for a period of time was to do these things as this was on a curved street, a curved road, and I was trying to put the two roads together like this with a frontage on the street, that the two roads would connect as one street. And the road service resisted it because the road service rule was no through streets, was cul-de-sacs. You can back in the license and say it was driven by a security agenda. But you understand why people say that? Because it suited the political or a military agenda. But you close off areas, you can close off Short Strand with two barriers, effectively. You can close off most rebuilt residential areas with one or two ways. And the people who still operate internally in their own internal network of paths and places and small roads. And my view has always been that that's never been the truth, actually. In a way, the notion about cul-de-sacs and one way in, one way out suited a lot of agendas. It suited military agenda, paramilitary agenda, global safety issues. In a way, I think there's an inquiry probably which is very hard to get to the bottom of at some level, is that the Belfast Development Office did have security personnel in their office. All proposals were vetted by the security personnel. I've been in meetings myself. I went in the 80s, part of the 70s, to meet the security people in the office. There are whole versions of truth what happened in this city since, and I think part of the problem is it hasn't been documented really in some ways and hasn't been critiqued at a level that says, what was the experience of the guys building the house in the 70s.
It has been unfortunate that what our whole history over the past 50 years that we seem to have to bring in other people to sort of building urban issues, and throughout the Matthew Plan, Travers Morgan, remember recently with our Titanic Quarter and then with our Diamond Leading scheme, Divis in West Belfast, or Divis in the Maze, and then recently Belfast City Council appointing consultants from Canada to create a new strategy plan. There seems to be this lack of confidence that we can do it ourselves, which is unfortunate, I think. It's so easy for people then to not like it. Belfast has got so many plans.
Yeah.
But the thing is, paper the wall. But the important thing is that they're not really plans. They're just a load of words and a load of aspirations and a load of diagrams and stuff like that. There isn't a real framework plan in the European tradition of actually building a vision for the city. That then, if somebody wants to build something somewhere, they know what it's going to be their neighbour in 20 years' time down the road. I mean, Belfast, we've talked about it being a bit behind what's happening in other places and that, but one of the things that we've always said, why can't we leapfrog? Why can't we learn from the mistakes that they all make? And they do make mistakes. I mean, they make mistakes all over the UK and all over Europe. And if we're that little bit behind, we shouldn't just repeat the mistakes.
I suppose, for me as an architect, living or born in the city, lived in both North and West Belfast, I felt that it was my job as an architect, I suppose, to engage with my fellow citizens and to find a way to make a better quality of life for people. I had that notion from fairly early on as a young person in four-star architecture school. Probably that period of the 60s, late 60s, that impacted on me as a young kid, I suppose, and that in 69, when the kind of vans up at the streets of the city, the one street which was the kind of simple symbol of the destruction and the kind of wanton violence was Bombay Street, because it was a whole street, and the notion locally was that maybe people could rebuild that street themselves, and that came, I think, because my father and a few other people had just finished a housing project in the west part of the city for an Irish language community. They were all Belfast people. They all lived in west of the city. They all taught in the art school in the city centre, taught in Clonard and Hawthorne Street and Clonard. Their view was that they would either move to Donegal or to move somewhere like a rural part of Tyrone or something like that, or you would build in their own city. And they decided to do that and got land, I think, maybe from the church actually. So they did that in about 66 to 68 or thereabouts. So they finished building those houses just before 69 started. So they had the experience of designing the houses, fundraising the houses, doing the legal work, make sure they could build them properly, get all the approvals, and they felt when the street was burnt that they could rebuild that street. Belfast Corporation was the planning authority, effectively, they had at the time. And they resisted it, at one time promised to help build the street, and then it became very clear by the end of 69 that what they wanted to do was to build the first buffer zone in Belfast. That was their proposal, that they should keep the street clear and build a buffer zone so you wouldn't have any more violence, or at least you could control it in a fashion. But these guys felt that they would actually fundraise to rebuild the street. So my weekend job, I suppose, as a 14-year-old, was to drive up down East Coast to churches mostly, from Belfast to North Dublin, and to do collections outside the churches to buy a brick for Bombay Street. And the brick for Bombay Street wasn't to throw people, it was to build one compound, rebuild walls. And I suppose that's, even though I was only a kid on the outskirts stuff, you could hear things and see things and realise actually that the act of doing that is a fairly strong thing for people to say, we can build our own place ourselves, we don't need anybody to tell us how to do it. What inspired me as an architect, I suppose, was that that's why I started in the architecture, but what confirmed me as a role as an architect probably was within about 1 or 2 years of college, I realised that there were a few both architects and designers who actually could inspire, and one of them was Victor Papanek. And Victor Papanek's design for the real world was about saying professional people and designers should give off their time to their community, start recording it, because that's what I was doing for a more period of time. I'd say, well, actually, this is reasonable, it's been done by other people elsewhere, not just because of this small street. And the other part of it was Bernard Chimney was teaching at the AA at the period of the 70s, and about 75 or 76 he wrote this thesis, and he was just putting a simple challenge out to say to people, is the architect the form giver? So what he was doing was saying, is it the same as Victor Papanek saying, the guy says you want a nappy or a diaper for your parrot, sure, no problem at all, what colour do you want it in? And that's what architects were doing effectively. The corporate market was saying we want to have a tall skyscraper or a tall building, or knock that old building down and build something new, and he said, yeah, sure, and how big do you want it? Or you were saying you could be a lobbyist or an activist or an advocate in some kind of fashion, or you recognised that there was a way to understand the mechanism of the city, the mechanism of fundraising and money and politics and change and power, and where power would lay, and you would use your skills with that background experience to actually improve quality of life for ordinary people. So for me, the notion that you can do things yourself, you can negotiate directly, and you understand the political mechanism and the funding mechanism was what inspired me to do architecture. And the more I thought about it since, that street was actually about saying that way of making a place, just simple, low activity in the fine grained modern place, is a reasonable way to make streets. It wasn't adventurous, it wasn't high-blown architecture, but it was a way to improve living. And that for me was why I chose architecture. I know when I first went up was in 1975 or 76 to do that work in New Lodge, the House Executive decided they would demolish the bottom half of the streets, so they knocked down 500 houses and they put back roughly 240. But nobody actually, even the housing activists, didn't actually work out in their head to say every 500 houses we're going to lose 260. I think people accepted that, and even today, in a way it's kind of odd in some ways, from people you'd expect to be more vociferous and more challenging in some ways, still accept the notion if you want a new house, you have to knock down 3 to put back 1 a bit. I don't personally understand why they can't really find a way to say, what are our other choices? What if? Because there's nobody actually helping people to say, we will help you with to equip you with the language and the skills to challenge what you've been told by your either officials or people in some kind of power and authority. Mark and myself did a bit of peace work with a group from, I took them to Amsterdam, living housing schemes over there. I paid for them to go across, 2 people from New Lodge and 2 or 3 from Mount Vernon to go to the Amsterdam. The simple one was Ronald Sporenberg, which is 3-story with allegedly ground floor commercial. Before we left, Mark and I sat down in the office and put down the 10 things that made a good house. And I took them to Borneo, walked them around, and the first time I went down one of the streets, this guy said to me, who's a housing activist in New Lodge, said, don't like this place, big long streets. And I said, you flipping live in New Lodge? Where the streets used to be twice the length of the R9 and I'm down the whole way down, like 500 metres or 300 metres over. Once he realised that, and he realised went into some of the rooms and realised that the houses had very good living rooms, that had private space but was on the roof or a balcony. His list of the 10 best things for a house was identical to the list that Mark and I had done. We were coming from it as architects. And I think that the problem with somebody is not so much that the architect knows best, but the architect should have enough skills and enough experience to be able to say, yeah, that's right, you want to have a new house, that's fair enough, but what if the project was a house and a garden on the roof? What if the garden was on the balcony on the first floor? What if you shared a space with somebody else? What if your car was pulled 2 doors away and not outside your own front door? Do you just keep challenging and pushing and pushing and pushing them? I think that involvement, participation, doesn't negate the role of the architect. The architect has a huge experience and is bringing a breadth of architectural culture with a very rich inflection from other places that some other people don't have because they haven't travelled. When I went to New Lodge, the guys I took to Amsterdam with the New Lodge people, the guy who was in his 50s then had never been outside Ireland. So for him to go and see a place entirely different, which is why we did the first city culture bit for Belfast. One of the projects at the time was to say we will take people from Berlin Street to Berlin, people from Jerusalem Street to Jerusalem, and bring something back. And that notion of getting out more often, or getting out at all, actually, is important to be done. And architects can bring that. And people actually value it.